The courtroom air felt stale, heavy with polished wood and quiet judgment, and my hands were trembling even though I was sitting perfectly still. At 67 years old, dressed in a plain navy outfit, I listened as my entire life was reduced to something small, dismissible, almost laughable. The sound of papers shifting behind me felt louder than my own breathing, and I realized I was being studied, not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. If you've ever been underestimated or spoken over, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Moments like this happen more often than we admit. I remember staring at the edge of the table, noticing a tiny scratch in the wood, because it was easier than meeting the eyes already deciding who I was. In that moment, grief, love, and decades of sacrifice were being rewritten by strangers with confidence and authority. What none of them knew was how wrong they were. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I was sitting in a courtroom at 9:15 a.m., 67 years old, hands folded so tightly in my lap they had gone numb, when I felt my entire life reduced to something small and dismissible. I was there because my husband was gone, because his son had taken me to court, and because I was being described as if I were an inconvenience instead of a person. From where I sat, I could feel the imbalance before I could name it. The polished wood, the elevated bench, the quiet confidence on the other side of the room. I noticed how easily attention flowed away from me and settled on the man who had the better suit, the louder presence, the practiced certainty. I noticed how a single label, spoken lightly, could erase decades of care, patience, and sacrifice in an instant. What unsettled me most was not the judgment in the room, but the comfort with which it arrived. This was not a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. Every glance, every pause, every subtle smile carried the same message. I was expected to be small, grateful, and silent. As I sat there, breathing slowly, I understood something that would take the rest of the story to fully reveal. The people watching me believed they knew exactly who I was, and they could not have been more wrong. In that room, I was being spoken about as if I were a single, simple thing. But that version of me barely resembled the woman I had actually lived as. I am 67 years old now, a widow, someone who learned how to carry quiet responsibility without asking for recognition. For many years, my life revolved around care, around showing up every day even when no one was watching. I had been a wife in the truest sense of the word, not just in name, but in presence. I managed a home, yes, but I also managed fear, uncertainty, and decline with steady hands. I learned medications, schedules, moods, and silences. I learned how to sit beside someone at 3:40 a.m. when sleep would not come, and how to keep going the next morning as if that kind of love was ordinary. What troubled me was how easily all of that disappeared once it was spoken about from the outside. How caregiving, when done quietly, becomes invisible. How sacrifice, when it happens behind closed doors, is mistaken for dependence or lack of worth. I was still grieving. Some days, the loss felt manageable. Other days, it pressed against my chest without warning. Sitting there in court, I realized something painful and unexpected. My grief was no longer just mine. It was about to be questioned, reshaped, and used against me. I woke that morning the same way I had every morning since my husband died, slowly, as if my body was afraid of what the day might ask of me. The house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Every sound softened, every room holding on to his absence. I made coffee I barely tasted and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the chair he used to claim without thinking. Grief had settled into routine by then. I moved carefully, deliberately, as if sudden motion might break something inside me. That was when the knock came. Not loud, not cruel, just firm enough to demand attention. An envelope was placed in my hands, heavier than paper should feel. I read it standing there, then again seated, then once more because my mind refused to accept the words. I was being accused of manipulation, of taking advantage, of rewriting love into control. The language was cold, official, stripped of memory. 20 years of care reduced to a list of allegations typed on white pages. I thought of hospital nights, of learning medications, of holding steady when everything else was failing. None of that existed on those pages. What existed was power, and the need to reclaim it. At first, I felt stunned, then still. In that stillness, something hardened into resolve. This was no longer about grief. It was about being erased, and I knew I could not allow that. When I married my husband, his son was already old enough to understand what had been lost and to resent what came after. I met him carefully, knowing I was stepping into a space shaped by memory and loyalty. I did not try to replace anyone. I did not demand closeness. I focused on patience, believing time might soften what grief had hardened. For years, I showed up quietly. I learned what he liked to eat, where he preferred to sit, when to stay out of the way. The distance between us never closed, but I told myself that coexistence was enough. As he grew older, that distance became routine. He came around when he needed help, when money was short, when life felt unmanageable. His father always said yes. I stayed silent, not because I agreed, but because peace felt more important than being right. That silence had a cost. The more I held back, the more resentment seemed to grow, unspoken but present. When my husband became ill, the balance finally broke. I was there for the appointments, the medications, the long nights when fear settled in. His son stayed away, always meaning to come later. Later never arrived. I do not believe this began as a legal dispute. It began as something older and more personal. A belief that I had taken a place that was never meant for me. By the time the papers were filed, the anger had already been rehearsed for years. The courtroom was simply where it finally found its voice. Walking into that courthouse felt like stepping into a place built to remind you of your size. The ceilings were high, the floors hard and echoing, every sound carrying farther than it should. I could feel my footsteps hesitate, not from fear, but from awareness. This was not a space designed for comfort or understanding. It was designed for order, authority, and quiet submission. I took in the room slowly. Rows of polished benches, the raised platform where decisions were made, the careful choreography everyone else seemed to understand. Across from me sat my stepson, relaxed, confident, surrounded by paperwork and presents. He looked like someone who belonged there. I looked like someone passing through. When the judge entered, the shift was immediate. The room straightened. Voices disappeared, and I felt the weight of formality settle over my shoulders. I was asked about representation, and I chose to stand alone. Not because I thought it would be easy, but because hiring someone felt like admitting I had done something wrong. I trusted the truth more than performance. I could sense the quiet reactions around me, curiosity, doubt, something close to pity. I sat with my hands folded, posture calm, expression steady. What I did not realize then was how that calm would be read. My restraint, my politeness, my unwillingness to dramatize my pain were already being mistaken for weakness, and that misunderstanding was about to be used against me. Sitting there, I listened as my life was carefully rearranged by people who had never lived it. Details were lifted, stripped of meaning, and placed back together in a way that made me almost unrecognizable. The years I spent caring for my husband were described as if they were evidence of control. The quiet decisions I made to keep our days running were treated like proof that I was incapable of understanding anything beyond routine. What hurt most was how easily it seemed to land. I could feel the room leaning toward that version of me, nodding along, accepting it because it was simpler. A woman who stayed home, a woman who depended, a woman whose kindness could be reinterpreted as weakness. My silence, which had always been my way of preserving dignity, was now being used as confirmation of everything they wanted to believe. I wanted to explain, to add context, to remind them that care is not the same as control, and that love does not make someone small. But I stayed where I was, steady, listening as my competence was questioned and my intentions flattened into suspicion. Each accusation pressed down on something I had worked hard to keep intact. When the session ended, the room emptied quickly. Conversations resumed. Chairs scraped back. Lives continued. I remained seated for a moment longer, feeling the weight of being misunderstood settle fully on my shoulders. It was in that quiet, after the damage had already been done, that I felt a shift. Something inside me stopped bending. I realized I could not endure this version of myself being spoken into existence any longer. That night, the house felt heavier than it ever had. Not louder, not sadder, just weighted with everything that had gone unsaid. I moved through the room slowly, touching familiar edges, letting the silence settle. The courtroom replayed itself in fragments, not as words, but as sensations. The way my chest tightened, the way I stayed still. I found myself standing in my husband's study without deciding to go there. The room was exactly as he had left it, shelves untouched, papers aligned with care. It was a place he preserved deliberately, as if some things were meant to wait. I sat at his desk and allowed myself to breathe, really breathe, for the first time all day. That was when I noticed it. A small detail I had overlooked countless times. Something tucked away, not hidden, just patient. I followed that quiet pull and opened a drawer I had never opened before, guided by memory more than curiosity. Inside were documents that stopped me cold. Evidence of a life I had lived fully and then set aside. Training, credentials, a past shaped by discipline and authority, not dependence. I recognized myself in those pages immediately, not the woman they described in court, the woman I had chosen to quiet for love, for partnership, for a life built together. That choice had not erased me. It had only paused me. I sat there for a long time, holding that truth, feeling it settle into place. The humiliation of the day did not disappear, but it changed shape. It no longer pressed down on me. It steadied me. That was the night I stopped waiting. Not for approval, not for understanding. I understood myself again, and that was enough to move forward. I returned to the courthouse the next morning looking exactly the same as I had the day before. Same posture, same quiet pace, same unremarkable presence. That was intentional. I wanted nothing to distract from what mattered. What no one could see was that I was no longer carrying uncertainty with me. Inside, everything felt sharper. I noticed details I had missed before. The rhythm of the room, the way confidence settled differently on people who assumed control was permanent. Across from me, my stepson and his attorney looked at ease, already behaving as if the outcome were decided. They saw the same woman they had dismissed yesterday. They had no reason to look closer. As the proceedings resumed, I listened carefully, not defensively, not anxiously, but with clarity. Each word landed where it belonged. Each assumption revealed itself without effort. When it was time for me to respond, I did so without haste. I moved deliberately, not to perform, but to be precise. Something subtle shifted. I could feel attention recalibrating, not because I demanded it, but because I was no longer shrinking. The judge watched more closely. The room grew quieter. It was not dramatic. It was measured. I understood then that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through preparation and self-trust. I remained seated, composed, fully present, aware that the balance in the room was no longer fixed. What they believed was confidence was actually complacency, and what they mistook for simplicity was about to change everything. The shift did not come with an announcement. It arrived quietly, through a procedural question meant to clarify a record. I stood to answer, steady, aware of how ordinary the moment appeared. What followed felt less like a reveal and more like a correction, as if the room had finally aligned with the truth it had been missing. As I shared my full background, I felt recognition begin to ripple outward, not certainty at first, just a pause, a recalibration. Then it settled. I had not always lived the life they described. Long before I became a wife and a caregiver, I had held authority of my own. I had been trained to listen, to decide, to carry responsibility without spectacle. I had stepped away from that world by choice, not limitation. Across the room, confidence drained in real time. I noticed it in posture, in the sudden stillness where ease had been. The attorney who had spoken so freely about my supposed incompetence seemed to falter, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. Papers stilled. Breathing changed. The certainty they carried could not survive contact with what had just been clarified. I remained where I was. I did not react. There was no satisfaction in the moment, only a deep sense of inevitability. This was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about being accurately seen. The courtroom felt different then, quieter, heavier. No one rushed to fill the silence. The imbalance that had defined the room began to collapse under its own weight. For the first time since this began, I was not being spoken over or interpreted. I was simply present. In that stillness, something essential shifted. The story they had been telling no longer held, and from that point on, the truth required no defense. After the silence settled, the process continued in a way that felt almost ordinary. There was no need for raised voices or sharp rebuttals. What mattered had already shifted. From that point on, the truth carried itself. I watched as records were reviewed, not dramatically, but carefully. Financial patterns laid out over time. Decisions my husband had made deliberately, with clarity and foresight. He had anticipated confusion, even conflict, and he had prepared for it quietly, the same way he approached most things. There was comfort in seeing that preparation acknowledged, not as strategy, but as responsibility. What became clear was not manipulation, but consistency, not exploitation, but intention. The story that had painted me as controlling could not withstand documentation that showed years of transparency and choice. Responsibility stood in contrast to entitlement without needing commentary. The difference spoke for itself. When the decision came, it arrived without flourish. It did not feel like a victory. It felt like an alignment, a recognition that what had been distorted was now back in proportion. The accusations no longer had space to exist. I remained seated, breathing evenly, letting the moment pass through me. There was relief. Yes, but more than that. There was a deep stillness, a sense that something had been corrected rather than won. As the room slowly returned to motion, I understood that this chapter was closing, not with celebration, but with clarity. And that clarity would shape what came next, long after the courtroom emptied. In the weeks that followed, life did not suddenly feel lighter. It felt quieter. The urgency faded first, then the tension. What remained was space, and I had to decide how to live inside it. I did not return to the life I had before everything unraveled. Some parts of it no longer fit. I chose work that felt purposeful rather than impressive, steady rather than consuming. I wanted my days to feel intentional, shaped by choice instead of reaction. Healing did not arrive all at once, but it arrived consistently. In small moments of calm I had forgotten were possible. My relationship with my stepson changed, though not neatly. We spoke again, carefully. There was acknowledgement, but not full repair. I learned that reconciliation does not always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like honesty without expectation and distance without resentment. That was enough for now. I spent more time listening to myself, to what felt right, to what no longer needed proving. The past did not disappear, but it loosened its grip. I carried it forward without letting it decide what came next. As life settled into a new rhythm, I understood something important. The courtroom had closed a chapter, but it had also opened something quieter and more enduring, a chance to live without shrinking and without needing anyone else to validate who I already knew myself to be. Looking back now, what stays with me is not the courtroom or the outcome, but the quiet lesson hidden underneath it all. How easily a life can be reduced to a label. How quickly years of effort, love, and integrity can disappear when someone decides who you are without ever asking. For a long time, I allowed myself to be small because it felt easier, because I believed that being useful, supportive, and silent was enough. But worth does not come from the roles we play for others. It comes from the truth we carry about ourselves, even when no one else can see it yet. If you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or spoken about as if you were less than the sum of your life, I want you to know this. Invisibility does not mean insignificance. Quiet does not mean weak. And choosing love or care does not erase strength. I am grateful you stayed with me through this story. Grateful that you listened, that you held space for it, and that you saw what so often goes unseen. Stories like this matter because they remind us we are not alone in these moments. If any part of this resonated with you, I invite you to share your experience. Have you ever been reduced to a single role or misunderstood in a way that stayed with you? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and I would be honored to hear your story.